The hushed rustle of heavy purple curtains separates the exultant hum of street. Peter's Square, from a space where time seems to stand still in the thick, cool air, permeated with the scent of old wood and centuries of tranquility. The man who has just crossed this threshold only a few minutes ago was one of many, an equal among equals in the Purple College, sharing with his colleagues the burden of choice and uncertainty. But as soon as the heavy oak doors close, reality itself undergoes an irreversible transformation. In this cramped room, hidden from the eyes of pilgrims, high-ranking diplomats, and the lenses of television cameras worldwide, the newly elected pontiff is left alone for the first time with the colossal burden he is to carry until his last breath. There are no solemn hymns here, no applause is heard, only a piercing silence broken only by his own breathing and the realization that his former life, with all its habits, names, and personal attachments, has forever remained on the other side of these walls. This place is officially called the Sala delle Lacrime, or the Room of Tears, and its every name, every detail of its ascetic interior is imbued with a history far older than any of the current inhabitants of the Vatican Palace. When the long-awaited white smoke rises above the Sistine Chapel, the world sees in it only a beautiful symbol, the culmination of intrigue and the beginning of a new stage in the lives of billions of people. Thousands of believers in the square begin to shout frantically, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica begin their solemn peal, and world news agencies hastily check the biographical data of candidates, trying to predict the future. However, inside the palace itself, at this moment, a process unfolds that is completely devoid of any external glitter and fuss. The elected cardinal, having given his official consent to accept this burden, proceeds to a tiny room of only about 9 square meters. This space, located to the left of the altar where Michelangelo's monumental fresco, The Last Judgment, is situated, becomes the first instance of his new absolute power, and at the same time, his first voluntary prison. It is here, amidst extremely simple surroundings, that the metamorphosis of a living person into a living symbol, of an individual into a vicar with 2 millennia of history behind him, takes place. The history of this unique tradition dates back to those distant times when the succession of power in Rome was a matter not only of spiritual leadership, but also of the physical survival of all Western civilization. The very name Room of Tears arose not as a poetic allegory, but as a description of a very specific, deeply human reaction to what was happening. It is believed that almost every pontiff, finding himself in this room, could not withstand the colossal emotional and spiritual tension. These are not tears of disappointment or weakness, but rather tears of final farewell. From this moment on, the person no longer belongs to himself, his family, his order, or his country. He becomes part of an endless chain, another link, burdened by the undeniable authority of 265 predecessors. In this tiny space, all the fragility of human nature in the face of infinity is concentrated, as understood within the framework of the complex church hierarchy. Preparation for this sacred moment begins long before the cardinals gather for the conclave and are locked away, awaiting inspiration. Those responsible for the church leader's wardrobe, representatives of the famous Gamarelli family, whose tailors have served the papal throne since 1798, prepare 3 sets of white vestments in advance. These cassocks are sewn in 3 standard sizes: small, medium, and large. Since no one can say with certainty in advance who exactly will emerge victorious from the Sistine Chapel In this spiritual marathon, the tailors rely on probability theory and centuries of experience. In the Room of Tears, these 3 white spots against the dark panels and austere furniture await their hour. They lie on a table, ready to accommodate any electee, be it a lean, ascetic philosopher or a stout, energetic administrator. This is a silent but eloquent reminder that the role of the head of the church is immeasurably greater than any person who fulfills it. If the clothing doesn't fit perfectly, it is adjusted on the spot with pins and the deft fingers of assistants in a matter of minutes. For the world outside the palace cannot wait too long. The process of vesting in this room is devoid of haste, but filled with deep inner symbolism. By removing the red cardinal's vestments, which he had worn for decades, the man symbolically concludes his existence in his former capacity. The color red, the color of blood, readiness for martyrdom, and active service, is replaced by the dazzling white of purity, peace, and spiritual resurrection. In this change of clothes lies a surprising paradox. The highest power on earth is accepted through a rite that simultaneously resembles both a funerary shroud and the birth of a baby. The assistants act quickly, professionally, and in complete silence, while the newly elected leader is often in a state of deep shock. Many witnesses to this process later described how strong, willful men, accustomed to managing vast dioceses, appeared utterly lost in these moments, their hands trembling involuntarily and their gaze fixed blankly, as if they were trying to peer beyond the veil of the future. The 19th century introduced its dramatic adjustments to the perception of this ritual, adding the poignancy of political crisis. When Giovanni Maria Mastai Ferretti, who took the name Pius IX, was elected in 1846, his stay in the Room of Tears dragged on beyond all measure. It is said that he was so long unable to recover from the realization of the scale of political storms tearing through Europe at the time and threatening the very existence of the papal state, that the master of ceremonies was forced to gently remind him 3 times of the tens of thousands of people awaiting his appearance in the square under the scorching sun. Later, in the 20th century, as the world became more transparent and information-rich, details of the pontiff's time in this room gradually began to leak into the press through memoirs, diaries, and cautious recollections of close associates. John XXIII, a man of legendary calmness and lively humor, reportedly spent several minutes in the Room of Tears in complete silence before remarking with good-natured irony to his companions that the biggest challenge in his new position was finding a belt of the right size for his build. However, even behind this joke lay a clear understanding that from this particular day, his personal peace and right to privacy were forever over. The room's interior is emphatically simple, creating a stark contrast with the lavishness of the papal regalia. Here, there are only a crucifix on the wall, a table, a few chairs, and those 3 sets of clothes neatly laid out by assistants. This simplicity is necessary to remind a man, at the moment of his highest earthly triumph, of his true, earthly, and transient nature. Cases have been preserved in the annals of history where elected cardinals tried to refuse the offered post precisely at this moment, realizing in the confines of the Chamber of Tears that the burden of this responsibility was physically and spiritually overwhelming. But the rigid mechanisms of canon law and the immense moral pressure from colleagues almost always made this retreat impossible. Thus, the room becomes a place of final, irreversible acceptance of one's fate, a kind of altar upon which a person lays down their right to personal freedom. The layer of political reality in this context is no less significant than the spiritual. The Chamber of Tears is not only a place for prayer and reflection, but also a crucial technical gateway in the system of state administration. It is here that the pontiff receives the first official attributes of his power. He is presented with the white pileolus, a small silk skull cap that will henceforth be his permanent headwear, and shown a sketch of the fisherman's ring, which will be custom-made and later destroyed after the end of his earthly journey. This is the moment when the complex administrative machinery of the Vatican officially recognizes its new leader. All subsequent documents, decrees, appointments, and diplomatic notes that will change the course of history will derive their legal and spiritual force precisely from these 9 square meters. Here, the democratic process of the conclave finally concludes, and a unique form of absolute monarchy begins, limited only by centuries of tradition and the demands of higher law. If one examines in detail the personalities who passed through this office, one can see a true cross-section of all human history over the past centuries. In 1978, when Karol Wojtyła, who became the first Slav in this position for many centuries, entered the room, it was not merely a person changing into new clothes. It was a true tectonic shift in global geopolitics, the beginning of the end of one era and the birth of another. Witnesses of those events recalled that he entered the Chamber of Tears with a resolve that would later change the political map of Europe and the world. But even he, a man of incredible will, who had passed through the crucible of war and the brutality of totalitarian systems, spent the time allotted in that room for deep internal contemplation and realization. His successor, Joseph Ratzinger, an outstanding theologian and thinker who took the name Benedict XVI, later described his feelings in those minutes as the sensation of a guillotine that suddenly and mercilessly descended upon his accustomed, measured life as a scholar and guardian of doctrines. For him, the snow-white cassock became a burden from the very first moment, which he eventually, 8 years later, decided to lay down during his lifetime, performing an act unprecedented for 600 years. The feeling of absolute isolation within the walls of this room is significantly amplified by the fact that directly beyond its door stand people who, only this morning, were close friends, like-minded individuals, and colleagues, but who now, in an instant, have transformed into subjects bound to observe the strictest etiquette. The line between equality and hierarchy blurs in a single second. The deep internal conflict of each new pontiff lies in the agonizing necessity to suppress the ordinary human within themselves, with all their natural weaknesses, inclinations, habits, and personal opinions, in order to transform into a living, infallible mouthpiece of age-old doctrine in matters of faith. In the Room of Tears, this painful process of gradual self-renunciation for the sake of impersonal service to the institution is initiated. It is believed that it is for this reason that tears so often visit the chosen ones in these moments. They genuinely mourn their lost freedom, the ability to simply wander aimlessly through evening streets, visit beloved bookstores, engage in casual private conversations, or visit loved ones. From this moment on, their every sigh, every gesture, and every word will be closely watched by more than 1 billion faithful followers, and every movement will be subjected to detailed analysis by political experts and intelligence agencies worldwide. The philosophical aspect of the existence of such a unique place as the Room of Tears touches upon the most intimate essence of the nature of power. In modern popular culture, leadership is almost always associated with resounding triumph, personal success, the joy of victory, and universal jubilation. The Vatican tradition, however, completely overturns this notion, firmly and consistently asserting that the true acceptance of supreme power is first and foremost a personal tragedy and an act of profound humility. This is, in many ways, an ancient heroic approach, where the protagonist realizes the inevitability of their fate and accepts it without reservation. The room serves as a kind of spiritual filter that must cleanse the leader's soul of the remnants of pride and vanity before they appear before the gaze of millions. The white color of their new garments in this context is interpreted not as a sign of superiority or purity, but as a shroud in which the former personality of the person is solemnly wrapped, offered as a sacrifice to history. The annals of the Church also record those who tried to preserve fragments of their former identity, despite the rigid traditions of the Room of Tears. Francis, elected in 2013, broke many established protocols right in this room, setting the tone for his entire future reign. He categorically refused to use the purple mozzetta, a cape traditionally trimmed with valuable fur, and chose to remain in a maximally simple white cassock, keeping his old iron pectoral cross instead of the golden one prescribed by his status. His stay in the Room of Tears was notably short, yet profoundly symbolic. He seemed to strive to demonstrate that external decorations and ancient rituals should not obscure the true essence of serving people. Nevertheless, even he, with all his reformist energy, could not and did not want to avoid the obligatory ritual of solitude. This room is a great equalizer. Before its silence and simplicity, all pontiffs are equal in their human vulnerability and the awareness of the grandeur of the task before them. The profound transformation taking place within the walls of this modest room also has very tangible, practical consequences for the entire world. It is precisely here, in these few moments of solitude, that the pontiff definitively chooses his new name. This act is never accidental or merely a tribute to some specific predecessor. It is always a programmatic statement, defining the strategic vector of the entire organization's development for long decades to come. The choice of name in the silence of the Room of Tears is an act of supreme political and spiritual creativity. To call oneself Leo, Gregory, Pius, or Benedict means openly appealing to completely different historical eras, different methods of governance, and different priorities. In this piercing silence, looking at 3 white dresses of different sizes, a man makes a decision about which chapter in human history he will write with his own hand. The slightest error in choosing a name, or even in the first word of an official address, can cost the reputation and influence of the entire institution. So the price of these minutes in the Room of Tears is immeasurably high. The intrigue of any conclave always reaches its highest climax precisely in the moments of agonizing anticipation of the new pope's emergence from the Sala delle Lacrime. This time is officially known as the Holy Waiting. For the outside world, these are just long minutes or hours, but for the one inside, it is an eternity compressed into a brief moment. There is an ancient legend, passed down by word of mouth among the palace staff, that in this room there is a small mirror into which every pope is obliged to look before going out to the people. It is said that many intentionally try to avoid their reflection in these moments because they simply cannot recognize in this stern man in white the very cardinal who entered the Vatican this morning. This mirror becomes a metaphor for conscience, reflecting not a face, but the invisible yet palpable burden of responsibility for the salvation of millions of souls and the preservation of unity in an ever-changing and hostile world. The culmination of the entire multi-day process occurs at the moment when the heavy doors of the room finally open and the pontiff emerges to the first cardinal deacon, who is already prepared to proclaim to the whole world the famous formula, Habemus Papam. But a moment before this, another crucial rite takes place, the so-called First Obedience. All present cardinals approach their new head one by one to pay him their respects and allegiance. At this very moment, the room of tears finally ceases to be a place of private sorrow or personal reflection and transforms into the epicenter of global structural governance. The energy of the space changes instantly, from despondency and silence to clear, measured action. The man who, just a few minutes ago, was wiping away tears and battling an internal storm, straightens his shoulders, accepts official congratulations, and takes his first, most difficult step towards the famous central balcony overlooking the square. The significance of the Chamber of Tears in the context of humanity's long history cannot be overstated. In the modern era, when state power is too often perceived merely as an effective tool for self-expression, the achievement of personal ambitions, or the accumulation of material wealth, this ancient Vatican ritual serves as a powerful reminder of the concept of __quote _0__. It is a kind of psychological and ethical anchor that prevents a leader from forgetting their fundamental accountability to history, God, and eternity. The lesson this small room imparts is absolutely universal and applicable to any sphere of human activity. Any truly high and responsible position demands from a person a conscious relinquishment of a significant part of their ego. If a leader does not find the strength and courage to "one" their former comfortable state, they will never be able to truly and effectively lead others, as their attention will always be absorbed by preserving old habits, connections, and personal interests. Today, as we watch with bated breath the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, awaiting the appearance of a new leader, we see only the beautiful finale of a long, agonizing, and hidden process. We see welcoming gestures, hear the first blessings, and observe smiles. But beneath this external canvas always lies the living memory of those 20 or 30 minutes spent in the cramped and cold Chamber of Tears. This place remains one of the most guarded and respected secrets of the Vatican, not because it hides untold treasures or secret archives, but because it carefully preserves the truth about genuine human vulnerability in the face of eternity. This room irrefutably proves that even the most powerful, influential, and unwavering people in this world desperately need an intimate space where they are officially allowed, for a brief moment, to simply be human, before they definitively transform into symbols and living icons. Returning to the very beginning of this journey, to the moment when the doors of the Sala delle Lacrime close behind the newly elected, we begin to understand that the three sets of white vestments are not merely a trivial matter of physical size or tailoring convenience. This is a profound and multifaceted metaphor for absolute readiness for any turn of fate. The small, medium, and large sizes of the cassocks symbolize the different paths world history might take under the wise or stern leadership of the new leader. And when the pontiff finally emerges into the dazzling spotlight and the jubilant shouts of thousands of people, he carries on his shoulders not only the finest wool or silk of his new cassock, but also the invisible yet profound traces of that very silent and honest conversation with himself that just took place in the deep shadow of Michelangelo's altar. This eternal cycle of gaining power through humility and self-loss repeats itself from century to century with frightening and simultaneously hopeful regularity. The Chamber of Tears invariably stands in its historical place, always ready to receive the next chosen one, whose name today perhaps no analyst or expert yet knows. It reliably preserves within its stone walls the echo of thousands of prayers, heavy sighs, and sincere sobs of those outstanding individuals who, in different eras, led entire nations through the crucible of wars, periods of radical reforms, economic crises, and spiritual quests. And it is precisely in this endless, almost ritualistic return to human origins that the true secret of the astonishing resilience and longevity of one of humanity's oldest institutions lies. The pontiff's life truly ceases to belong to him from the very second he crosses the threshold of this room. And in this voluntary, conscious loss of one's own personality for the sake of serving a great idea lies the supreme paradox of power that continues to stir the minds of historians, writers, and ordinary people across the globe. Concluding our imaginary journey through the corridors of the Vatican Palace, hidden from prying eyes, we find ourselves again and again before this inconspicuous, tightly closed door. Behind it, absolute silence, 3 neatly folded white robes, and one single person making the most important decision of their earthly life. This is not merely a curious historical anecdote, not an archaic church rite, nor an element of a complex theatrical performance. This is a fundamental, basic reminder to all humanity that behind every great achievement, behind every large-scale historical shift, there always lies a moment of profound personal crisis, a time of agonizing doubts, and an act of conscious, heroic choice. And as long as the Room of Tears exists on earth, the world will remember an important truth. True, legitimate power begins not with the proud, triumphant gaze of a victor, but with a deep and humble awareness of the unbearable weight of the crown that one is henceforth destined to bear until the end of one's days. Each time a barely perceptible white smoke flies over the roofs of the eternal city, we involuntarily recall this small room. We think of the silence that, in these moments, deafens more than the cries of a crowd of thousands in the square. We remember the tears that do not defile, but purify the path for new ideas and great achievements. And we realize that ultimately, any story, no matter how grand, monumental, and global it may seem from the outside, always boils down to a single individual standing in an empty room before the mirror of their conscience, choosing their fate in the face of infinity. This moment of truth in the Room of Tears remains the most human moment in the history of power, reminding us that beneath any vestment, beneath any title, and behind any regalia, there always hides a heart capable of feeling, compassion, and mourning what was left behind for the sake of the future. Gazing into the history of those who emerged from these walls, we see not merely rulers, but people who passed through the crucible of self-denial. Pius XII, who ascended the throne on the eve of the 20th century's most terrible conflict, when the world stood on the brink of complete annihilation, surely sought in the silence of this room answers to questions that no mortal could resolve. His tears were tears for the millions who would suffer from the madness of war. John Paul I, whose reign lasted only 33 days, managed to leave in this room the imprint of his gentle humility, perhaps foreseeing the brevity of his path. Each such moment, each such episode adds a new layer to the aura of this space, making it the most important place in the Vatican, where the human meets the divine, and the private becomes the property of eternity. Thus, the Room of Tears is not merely a geographical point in the Apostolic Palace. It is a state of mind. It is an inevitable stage in the transformation of any leader who takes responsibility for the destinies of others. In a world where everything strives for transparency and publicity, the existence of such a closed, deeply intimate space emphasizes the importance of internal self-work. It is a reminder that before stepping out to people, one must look within oneself and honestly answer the question, are you ready to give everything you have for the cause you have chosen? And these three robes, small, medium, and large, will forever await new claimants, reminding them that no matter what size a person may be, their task will always be slightly greater than themselves. This is the great mystery of succession that has outlived empires, revolutions, and changes of eras, remaining true to that very first moment of silence in the tiny room next to the Sistine Chapel. The process of changing into white is not just a wardrobe change. It is a profound psychological initiation. It is believed that it is in these moments that the new pope finally grasps the magnitude of the task before him. He no longer belongs to his nation. He no longer represents the interests of his region. From this moment on, he is the shepherd of all humanity, as his status dictates. In the Room of Tears, the national and cultural boundaries in the leader's consciousness are finally erased. He becomes a citizen of heaven and earth simultaneously. This feeling of cosmopolitanism of the highest order is born precisely in the narrowness and modesty of this room. Many pontiffs later confessed that it was in these minutes that they felt a strange, frightening, but at the same time sublime sense of detachment from all earthly things, which allowed them to make decisions thereafter guided solely by higher interests and not by personal preferences. It is interesting that the physical parameters of the room, its narrowness and lack of extravagance, play a key role in this process. Psychologists note that a confined space forces a person to focus on their inner state, preventing them from being distracted by external stimuli. In the Room of Tears, there is nothing that could entertain the eye or occupy the mind, except prayer and the awareness of reality. It is a kind of sensory deprivation chamber where the only object for study becomes one's own soul and the weight of the accepted obligation. This asceticism is a deliberate tool for shaping the character of the new ruler. In a world overflowing with information and noise, such a forced pause becomes an invaluable gift, allowing one to find a foothold before stepping into the ocean of world politics. Reflecting on the future, we can be sure that the Room of Tears will retain its role in the coming centuries. Technology may change the way smoke is broadcast, social networks may make elections more discussed, but nothing can replace those 20 minutes of solitude that the human psyche needs to transition into a new quality. This room is an eternal oasis of authenticity in a world of simulacra and imitations. Here, everything is real. The fabric of the cassock, the cold of the marble, and the sincerity of tears. And in this authenticity lies the source of that incredible moral strength that the world often feels emanating from the papal throne, even in the darkest times of history. Concluding our excursion, it is worth emphasizing once again that the Room of Tears is a symbol that any power, if it wants to be lasting and just, must have at its core a deep awareness of responsibility and personal sacrifice. This is a lesson not only for church hierarchs, but also for each of us who, to one degree or another, bears responsibility for others. We all, at certain moments in life, pass through our own internal Room of Tears, when the old has already passed and the new still frightens with its unknown. And the example of those who found the strength to emerge from this room with their heads held high to serve the world remains one of the most inspiring examples in human history. The white smoke will dissipate, the crowd will disperse, but the silence of the Room of Tears will remain, holding the secret of true greatness born from the deepest humility.